The tarot card known as the Tower demonstrates the first stages of this synthesis, and it is not a gentle one. The 3 holes blasted in the walls symbolize the supernal triad, the establishment of the divine through the destruction of the outer self. Through fire and water, or warmth and moisture, which is essentially creative, their stimulation within the being of the neophyte draws his attention for the first time to the chaotic condition of his natural existence and the complete psychic muddle into which his ignorance and spiritual impotence have stranded him. Passing the gates of the land of night can be a tremendously jarring experience, but from these ruins can be erected a new temple of light, for it is always from the rubble that are selected the materials for the manifestation of Godhead. Aleister Crowley wrote, "The aspirant on the threshold of initiation finds himself suddenly attacked by the complexes which have corrupted him, and his agonized reluctance to their elimination plunging him into such ordeals that he seems, both to himself and to others, to have turned from a noble and upright man into an unutterable scoundrel." Regardie goes on to state, "It is my belief that the criterion or hallmark of successful initiation is in the occurrence of these or similar experiences. These are the experiences and events which occur to every aspirant when initiation forces the realization that all is sorrow. The whole universe seems to crumble like a pack of cards crazily cast about one's feet. This is the first half of the alchemical formula, solve et coagula. Analysis must come from this synthesis, and the alchemists of old made no mistake about it when they said, 'Poison is in the cure.' With the technique of initiation, the chaos is lifted up and fermented, that from it, with the aid from the invoked white light of the divine spirit, a higher species of being, illumined and enlightened, may develop." In the 2 altar diagrams, one called the Garden of Eden, showed in the Practicus grade, and the other called the Fall, shown in the Philosophus grade, we will find all these ideas are expanded and synthesized. They should be carefully studied and receive long meditation. The first depicts a personified representation of the 3 fundamental principles in man. Each of these is apparently separate, functioning independently on its own plane without cooperation with, apparently unaware of, either the higher or lower. Principally, it represents man in the now departed morning of the race, when self-consciousness had not yet been won by self-induced efforts, and when peace and harmony prevailed both within and without, by right of heritage rather than through personal labor. Practicus is a water grade, and water is a fitting representation of this placid peace. Let's identify some key symbols in the Garden of Eden diagram. At the summit of the diagram stands the apocalyptic woman, clothed with the sun of glory, crowned with 12 stars, and the moon lying at her feet. Her symbolism pertains to the supernal essence of mind, representing thus the type and symbol of Diogenes, the Neshama. Carl Jung described it as a principle of life that strives for superhuman shining heights. At the base of this tree stands Eve, the Nephish, or unconscious, who, in opposition to this divine genius, stands for the dark. Quoting Jung again, he says, "It is the earth-born feminine principle, with its emotionality and instinctiveness reaching far back into the depths of time and into the roots of psychological continuity." Between the 2 stands Adam, supported by the fundamental strength of Eve, the Ruach, or ego, not yet awakened to a realization of its innate power and possibility. From the larger point of view, he is the race as a whole, and is the personified symbol of the collective logos, the host, and the Lord of Wisdom, or the heavenly man who incarnated into humanity. Otherwise, he represents the individual candidate on the path prior to awakening. Beneath these figures sleeps a coiled dragon. None, it would seem, is aware of this titanic yet latent power, the act of magical power centered in man, his libido, neutral, of vast potentialities, neither good nor evil in itself. The next altar diagram, the Fall, appears in the fire grade of Philosophus. In contrast to the peaceful water, the power of fire is shown to have called forth catastrophe. Formally coiled beneath the tree, the hydra-headed dragon in this diagram has usurped its proper place. Its several horned heads wind their way up the very structure of the tree of life. Lured downwards by the tree of knowledge, we gather that the root of the trouble was an imperfect apprehension of creative power. The Bible speaks of this enticement to know the darkly splendid world wherein continually lieth a faithless depth. Eve, the lower self, ceases to give support to Adam. She has yielded to the awful fascination of the awakening psyche. Far easier is it to fall than to climb to the distant heights. Yet from one viewpoint is this fall catastrophic. The awareness of the rise of the dragon endows man with a consciousness of power, and power is life in progress. The dragon stands as the symbol of the great enemy to be overcome, and as the task of equilibrium proceeds, the great prize awaiting success. The alchemists describe this poisonous dragon as that which follows upon the corruption of first matter. But as the mystics teach, if this condition be patiently endured, it passes, and a higher spiritual consciousness can be found dawning in the heart and mind. The alchemist Vaughan writes, "And this dragon will turn to a swan, but more white than the hovering virgin snow when it is not yet sullied by the earth." Now let's consider the Kabbalistic Sufferer Da'at. It is the conjunction of Hakma and Bina on the tree of life, the child of wisdom and understanding, knowledge. Knowledge is formed by experience assimilated from the fall, the realization of illusion. The ascent of the dragon towards knowledge, or an upwelling of the unconscious archetypes, is highly volatile until they are assimilated to consciousness. It is the fall which is responsible for the acquisition of self-knowledge. Regardie offers some perspective. In the evolutionary scheme, the fall occurs through a higher type of intelligence coming into close contact with early humanity, thus stimulating the psyche of the race. In the individual sphere, the scheme is repeated through the technique of initiation whereby the red dragon is stirred into activity by the approach of the elements. The awakening of Da'at brings disaster at first because the awakened psyche is imperfectly understood and so abused for personal ends. But that very disaster and abuse grants consciousness of self. As a consequence, the realization of sorrow affects the ego, and an understanding of its cause always makes the first drive to perform the great work, even if the first decision is to see a psychologist. This drive and this higher type of consciousness are the makings of Da'at. It acts as the link between the higher genius and the soul bound by its fall to the world of illusion, sense, and matter. Until we open ourselves to the deepest parts of our unconscious, the red dragon will ravish the little kingdom of self. The adept must unite and integrate the various levels of his entire tree. He must train and develop the titanic forces of his underworld, so that they may become a powerful but docile beast whereon he may ride. The Adeptus Minor grade continues the theme of the two altar diagrams. This stage of initiation signifies the ideal outcome of taking on the great work. The lid of the symbolic vault, or tomb, in that grade shows a picture divided into two sections. The lower half depicts Adam, similar to before, but the heads of the dragons are falling back from the tree, showing the justified one, the illuminated adept, by his refinement and self-sacrifice, rescuing the fallen kingdom of his natural self from the clutches of an outraged Eros. The upper half depicts a noble figure, fully enlightened. It is to this redemption of the personality, to regenerate the power of the dragon and attempt to bring the individual to some realization of his potential godhead, that is the object of the Adeptus Minor ceremony. Ritual demonstrates that like Osiris, Christ, and Mithra, and many another type of godmen, we too may rise from the tomb and become aware of our true divine natures. The usual order symbolism of the light was represented by a white triangle centered by the rose, this placed upon the ceiling. The floor design was so painted as to represent the red dragon and the forces of the primitive archetypes upon which the candidate trod as emblematic of his conquest. Placed in the center of the vault was the tomb, considered as a symbol of the higher divine genius. The whole ceremony depicts the spiritual rebirth or redemption of the candidate, his resurrection from the dark tomb or mortality through the power of the Holy Spirit. The rebirth, as creative psychology states, has always been associated with the mother. The neshama aspect of man that strives for superhuman heights is always portrayed as a feminine principle, passive, intuitive, and alluring. The reader is earnestly recommended to study the rituals again and again until it becomes automatic. Each path traversed and every grade entered had a so-called admission badge. 3 of the most important items of personal study to be accomplished while in the first or outer order, apart from memorizing the rudiments of the Kabbalah, were the Pentagram Ritual with the Kabbalistic cross, Tattva vision, and divination by geomancy and tarot. Let's take a look at these 3 important skills. The Pentagram Ritual is taught to the neophyte immediately after his initiation in order that he might form some idea of how to attract and come into communication with spiritual and invisible things. Just as the neophyte ceremony contains the essential symbolism of the great work, the Pentagram Ritual and Kabbalistic cross is the commencement of certain magical formula representing epitones of the whole of that work. The prime factor towards success in that exercise is to imagine that the astral form is capable of expansion, that it grows tall and high, until at length it has the semblance of a vast angelic figure, whose head towers amongst the distant stars of heaven. When this imaginative expansion of consciousness produces the sense that the height is enormous, with the earth as a tiny globe revolving beneath the feet, then above the head should be perceived or formulated a descending ray of brilliant light. The act of marking the shoulders, right and left, while vibrating the Sephirotic names, traces the horizontal shaft of the cross, equilibrating the light within the sphere of sensation. The study of different types of divination may seem difficult to understand in an order which purported to teach spiritual development. Rather, the principal object of these practical methods is that they stimulate, as few exercises can, the faculties of clairvoyance, imagination, and intuition. Divination as an artificial process may be wholly unnecessary and a hindrance to the refined perceptions of a fully developed adept, who requires no such convention to ascertain whence a thing comes and whither it is going. Yet these aids and stimuli have their proper place for the neophyte. These methods open the mind to intuitive perception, however it is often abused, and common sense to the magical art is as necessary as it is to all else. Originally, astrology was taught as part of the regular routine. Many good books on the topic have been published since the order exchanged papers to proliferate the lessons within. All that the order requires of the Adeptus Minor is that they should be able to draw up a map showing the position of the planets and signs, preparatory to certain operations requiring the invocation of zodiacal forces. Tattva vision requires but little mention in this place. For full instructions in this technical method of acquiring clairvoyance may be seen in a later volume. It may be interesting for the psychological critic to reflect upon the fact that it was this technique to which most members of the order devoted the greatest attention, the only technique in which, more than any other single branch of work, there is greater opportunity for deception and self-deception. In addition to these technical methods, there were meditations on the symbols and ideas of the whole system, and it was quite frequently suggested that the student go through the ceremonies, after having taken the grades, and build them up in his imagination, so that he relives them as vividly as when he was in the temple. The practical exercise that accompanied the portal grade was one in which the aspirant built up, again in the imagination, a symbolic form of the Kabbalistic tree of life, paying at first particular attention to the formulation of the middle pillar in the sphere of sensation, or the aura. Vibrating the divine names went far towards opening, in a safe and balanced way, the psycho-spiritual centers in which the Sephirot were but symbols. This technique, with the so-called vibratory formula of the middle pillar, which is a development therefrom, I consider to be one of the most important practical systems in the order. Let me now detail the curriculum or work prescribed in the second or inner order. The training of the Adeptus Minor consists of 8 separate items. preliminary, implements, neophyte formula, psychic, divination, angelic tablets, talismans, and consecration and evocation. In the early temples, there was also issued a catalog of manuscripts, enumerating in alphabetical order the documents circulating amongst the enterers of the inner order. Regardie goes on to say that within this system of self-initiation, there will be a range of results, but the seeker has everything they need in the pages within. All the important formula of magic require intensive study prior to experimental work. Furthermore, self-initiation can be a benefit for those who have the initiative, yet refuse to involve themselves in corrupt occult orders. You are being given a complete system of attainment which you must study and develop at your own leisure, applying it in your own particular way. Some of the documents have been tampered with over the years, some Kabbalistic knowledge condensed, in which more detailed material can be found in the Zohar and Sefer Yetzirah English translations. But in this work, flagrant tampering has been restored, and Regardie believed that this book is an accurate representation of the whole order work, from neophyte to Theoricus Adeptus Minor. Regardie goes on to note that other sections on talismans, sigils, clairvoyance, geomancy, and the Enochian tablets have been completely rewritten to make them more coherent, but he makes the following statement. This I avow and publicly swear. Where personally I have seen fit to make comment on any matter in the order to clarify the issue or to indicate its antecedents or connections in other parts of the work, that comment or remark is so marked by me with initials. Pay great attention to the scheme of the grade rituals until you get a bird's eye view. Intellectual acquaintance with every aspect is just as important as personal integrity and selfless devotion. Intellectual capacity and magical power do not matter unless applied to the great work, that is, the knowledge and conversation of the higher and divine genius. Know that this is not to be done lightly, for your amusement or experiment. The forces of nature were not created to be your plaything or toy. Much time should be spent studying and meditating on the glyph of the Tree of Life and memorizing all the important attributes, the divine names, names of the archangels, angels in the spheres, and the elements. Above all, a great deal of time and attention should be paid to the middle pillar technique of vibratory formula of divine names. The student can easily adapt any fair-sized room to serve as a temple. A small table with a black cloth will suffice as an altar. Since magic works by the intervention of symbol and emblem, the surrounding of the student's sphere with the correct forms of magical symbolism assists in the impression of those symbols within the aura or sphere of sensation, the true magical temple. As far as the instruments involved in ritual are concerned, I impress upon the serious student to make these instruments themselves. The knowledge acquired or the intuitive process that somehow are stimulated by the effort are well worth the task. These weapons and magical instruments are symbolic representations of psychic events or forces working within the inner self. They bring to life the person that was asleep. They become true talismans of power. The Lotus Wand is declared to have the colors of the 12 signs of the zodiac and is surmounted by the Lotus Flower of Isis. In nature, the Lotus Flower grows from the darkness and gloom of the secret depths, through the waters, ever aspiring to open its blossoms on the surface of the waters to the rays of the light of the sun. So is the true magical and spiritual will secreted within the hidden depths of the soul of man. Unseen, sometimes unknown and unsuspected, it lies latent through the whole of life. By these rites of magic, its symbols and exercises, we are enabled to assist its growth and development, by piercing through the outer husks of the restricting shell until it bursts into full bloom, the flower of the human spirit, the lotus of the higher soul. The rose cross is a badge synthesizing a vast concourse of ideas, representing in a single emblem the great work itself, the harmonious reconciliation in one symbol of diverse and apparently contradictory concepts, the reconciliation of divinity and manhood. It is a glyph in one sense of the higher genius to whose knowledge and conversation the student is eternally aspiring. In the rituals, it is described as the key of sigils and rituals. The sword is a weapon symbolizing the critical dispersive faculty of the mind. It is used where force and strength are required, more particularly for banishing than for invoking, as though conscious intellection were allied with the power of will. The elemental weapons of the wand, cup, dagger, and pentacle are symbolically representations of the forces employed for the manifestation of inner self, the elements required for the incarnation of the divine. They are attributed to the 4 letters of the Tetragrammaton. One last word of caution. Let me warn the student against attempting difficult and complex ceremonies before he has mastered the more simple ones. The syllabus provided on a former page for use of the minor adept grades the work rather well. Above all, the pentagram and hexagram rituals should be committed to memory so that no effort is required to recall at a moment's notice the points or angles of these figures from which the invocation of a certain force commences. After some time, and after considerable experience with the more simple consecration formula, the student, feeling more confident of himself in ritualistic capacity, can turn to the more complex ceremonies whose formula are summarized in the Z2 manuscripts. These require much preparation, intensive study, and a great deal of rehearsal and experience. Moreover, he must not be disappointed if at first the results fall short of his anticipations. Furthermore, let the student be aware of the booby trap which was set up in the order, of doing but one of these ceremonies, or superficially employing any phase of the system as though to pass an examination, and considering in consequence that he is the master of the technique.